Now, looking into 2026, surely everyone is very much interested regarding the direction of the United States of America. Particularly, we're looking at the international relationships. Now, take a step back. Now, in the year of 2025, the US has been very much occupied regarding international crisis. Not only we're looking at the complication regarding the war in Ukraine, and also we're looking at this heavy and also ongoing competition between US and China from this economic standpoint. Most importantly, how do we test the temperature or even the relationship between US and with some of the allies, particularly in the Europe? How do we know that looking into 2026, now more and more allies, or we call the friends and neighboring countries, are looking for bigger changes, and especially we'll look at the strategies under Donald Trump. Is President Trump going to readjust the policies or strategies when it comes to international matters? Or should we expect more than just the administration? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Professor Paul Poast. Professor Poast is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago and the Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Well, Professor Poast, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Well, again, the honor is all mine, sir. It's such a pleasure to have you on the show. As I mentioned before, initially when I discovered you, because this amazing piece that you wrote, which is entitled, How Much Abuse Can America's Allies Take? Longtime partners will soon start to drift away. Now, let's get to your article right away. Surely this year, as I mentioned before, is full of ups and downs when we look at the international relationships, particularly the war in Ukraine. I want to start with reading something that you wrote or co-authored in this article and want to get your reaction. This is what you wrote, and I quote, "Instead, the countries accommodated Donald Trump because they felt like loosening ties with the US would be more dangerous to their economic and security interests than trying to stand up to his abuse." End quote. Professor Post, from your perspective, when we look at the Trump administration, particularly from the foreign affairs perspective, how do we understand the word abuse at this moment? And why do you think some of the countries are rather intimidated by his foreign policy strategy? If that were to be true, what can we expect later on? Your thoughts.
It's a great question. And just as by way of a little bit of context, so yes, this piece that we just published in Foreign Affairs, I wrote this with Robert Kelly, who's at Busan University, National University in Korea. And this is actually a continuation of a argument that we had made in the print edition of Foreign Affairs back in 2022 in a piece that was titled "The Allies Are All Right." And what that piece was, it was kind of a reflection on where the U.S. alliances stood post Trump won, if you will. And the argument that we made in that paper was that basically the allies, and focusing specifically on core U.S. allies. So this was focusing on South Korea, Japan in the East Asian region, and then France and Germany in Europe. Obviously, there was a lot of other allies we could have talked about, both in Asia, East Asia, or in Europe. I mean, obviously, we didn't bring up the, quote, special relationship between the U.S. and Britain, but we decided it would make sense to kind of focus on how did those four particular allies adjust and relate towards Trump. And one of the big things, and hence the title of the piece, was just that they seemed to just tolerate it, right? They even took measures to even ingratiate themselves towards Trump. Probably most notably, this was done by Abe, the prime minister of Japan, where he even probably went, and part of that was probably due to the fact that he was even a bit ideologically aligned with Trump, but he was, one of the first world leaders to congratulate him. There's this great photo of like the two of them sitting there with these hats that say "Make the U.S.-Japan alliance great again." He would go golfing with Trump. He was doing everything to make Trump happy. And so The whole argument of that piece was that no, of course they weren't thrilled about Trump, and they were worried about the possibility that he could withdraw U.S. support or weaken the alliance relationship. But they were able to kind of navigate that. And at the end of the day, even if there was that concern, they're like, there weren't any better options. It's like, the worst that could happen is Trump would just not come to their aid, but the U.S. was not going to actually pose a direct threat to them versus other potential allies, because one of the arguments could be, well, maybe these allies would turn towards bandwagoning. If you're threatened by the People's Republic of China, maybe instead of trying to balance them, they would try to bandwagon with them. We're like, no, that's just not going to happen. At the end of the day, the U.S. is still the best option for them, even if Trump makes them a little nervous. So where this new piece comes in is obviously where you're now in the second Trump administration. Trump is no longer an anomaly. These allies can't sit there and say he's an anomaly and that's just a one-off. He's been reelected. And moreover, it seems like his America First foreign policy ethos is not just unique to him. It seems like there are other individuals who may even hold a stronger view of it than him and could potentially be heir apparent. So most notably J.D. Vance, the current vice president. If he were to become a presidential candidate, if he were to become president in 28 or 32 or something like that, would this be an even stronger version of this kind of like skepticism that Trump has expressed towards allies? So the context of this piece that we wrote that just came out was, in light of the fact that Trump is not a one-off, in light of the fact that there is the possibility that even without Trump, Trumpism towards U.S. allies could continue, what should the allies start doing now? And the answer is they're still going to stick with the United States. The U.S. is still their best option for balancing against the threats that they face, whether those threats are the People's Republic of China or they are Russia. They're still the best option. The U.S. is still the best option for them. However, in light of the obvious escalation of negative rhetoric towards U.S. allies, in light of the increasing demands that are being made on U.S. allies, in light of the heightened transactional approach that the Trump administration is taking towards the allies, these are all the kind of abuse that we're talking about here. So to get to your question, that's really what we mean by kind of abuse here. And then also just kind of raising questions about, despite all that, would the U.S. actually still come to their defense? What this means is these allies are now more seriously hedging. So a way that I kind of think about this piece is hope is not a strategy. They are hopeful that the U.S. will still come to their aid. They are hopeful that the U.S. will still be a reliable ally, but hope is not a strategy. So you hope, but you need to hedge at the same time. That means taking measures to ensure that you can still protect yourself or work with other allies if the U.S. is not there at some point in the future to protect yourself, to protect them.
Well, Professor Poast, it's rather fascinating to understand that the statement that you made, that hope is not a strategy, and certainly it is not in reality when we look at international relationships. But I do want to bring another concept into our conversation. By looking at the first term of Donald Trump, when we look at the domestic issues and also international matters, Trump seemed to enjoy this idea of royalism. So in other words, it's all about loyalty. It's all about patronizing to Donald Trump in order to get what they wanted at the first place. But fast forward, 2025, we're looking at the second term of Donald Trump. Again, look at the complication of his presidency. Going back to another word that we tend to use when we talk about Trump and with his air quote friends and or allies, you call it, is the word reciprocity. We know that Donald Trump constantly looks for deals, look for reciprocity, look for mutual benefits when it comes to allies. For example, the war in Ukraine. Initially, he thought he had Putin in his hands. But right now, again, recently he came up with the 28 points, proposed to Ukraine, but Ukraine straightforwardly rejected that plan because that didn't work. So from your perspective, how do we understand the word reciprocity at this moment when we look at the relationship with the allies? And do you think that it is still, I guess I want to be careful, that reciprocity and abuse can happen at the same time in order to wake up the allies, or in order to wake up people to realize, hey, this is the second term, it's not the first term. What do you say to that?
Yeah, so I like the way in which you kind of contrast the loyalty emphasis in the first term with the, as you say, reciprocity emphasis in the second term. And I would build on that a little bit by very clearly the loyalty aspect was there in his first term. I'd say it's still there in his second term too. And the idea of bestowing gifts upon Trump, whether that is going as far as declaring your intent to nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize, to, of course, the crown that was given to him by the South Korean government. These are examples of kind of this like gift giving, flattery type policies that are very much on display. We've seen that recently with, probably the best example of this is NATO's Secretary General. Whether it was Stoltenberg during the first term or Rutte now, both of them have gone out of their way of just saying Trump's way of doing things is exactly what NATO wants. And thanks to him, NATO's better. And it's all because of Trump. I mean, they're just giving all the credit to Trump, even if they know that that's not really what's going on. But they are totally on board with this flattery because they know that's key to keeping Trump engaged with the NATO alliance. And to be honest, and we could elaborate on it, I think it's been working, especially in the case of the NATO alliance. I think they're in better shape than they would be otherwise, absent that kind of flattery. So I think the flattery is still there. Having said that, I do want to focus more on this reciprocity idea. And I would say that Trump's approach is less reciprocity and much more transactional. So reciprocity suggests more of an equal quid pro quo. I will give you this and you will give me that, and they'll be of equal value and will mutually benefit, and it's all great. That I don't think is so much Trump's view. Trump's view is we will give you protection, maybe, but you need to be giving us a lot in return to compensate us for even the idea of our protection, right? And so it's much more in line with, and we actually use this phrase, we've used this phrase in our writing of a protection racket. It is much more in line of like kind of how a mafia runs a protection racket, which, by the way, that's not a uniquely Trumpian thing. I mean, this notion that alliances could be viewed as protection rackets has been used for years within the scholarly literature on alliances, that the idea that especially when you're in these relationships that are asymmetric, you have a major power protecting minor powers. These major powers are going to make a lot of demands of those minor powers for, goodies, if you will, in order to simply have the reassurance that I could come to your assistance if needed. And Trump seems much more bent on securing those kind of transactional deals this time around. And we saw that very recently in his tour, his Asia tour, where it was like every single one of his stops was about a trade agreement and a mineral deal. You brought up Ukraine. That was something that Zelensky, to his credit, recognized right away, that Zelensky was like, we're going to have to give him something. I mean, when Zelensky back in October of last year put forward his victory plan for Ukraine, one of the provisions of it was the mineral deal with the United States. Some people forget, they think, oh, that was Trump's idea. That was Zelensky's idea, because he knew that that's kind of what you have to do. You're going to have to offer him this stuff so he feels like we're getting compensation for the assistance that we've been providing. So it's made it much more, transactional in an asymmetric way, as opposed to more of an equal reciprocity type approach. And that's really, again, it's not a new thing per se, but Trump makes that much more direct, much more explicit, much more upfront than, say, it's been in the past.
Well, I mean, again, Professor Post, Donald Trump takes pleasure in knowing that any deal that he proposed in the past or he's about to propose in the future, hopefully it's not going to be a losing hand. I mean, again, when you play cards more often, you know that when you put cards on the table, that you're hoping that this is the deal that basically seal the game. And I think Donald Trump still enjoys or takes pleasure in knowing that, or even though sometimes we have this uncertainty that in the back of his head. Let's continue our conversation, Professor Post. In the article, you also mentioned about the former U.S. President Joe Biden back in 2020, that this is such a term that, again, I have to say, you're the expert. I'm not a political scientist, and nor am I a historian, but we have been paying attention to what we called American liberal internationalism for so long. So from your perspective, again, it's rather foolish to ask Professor Yu to say, hey, what is the comparison contrast when we look at liberal internationalism in Trump or Biden? But I still do want to ask, from the national security strategy perspective, why do you think that Donald Trump seemed to walk away slowly and also quietly away from this liberal internationalism, but instead try to repackage the image of America to something else? What do you think of that?
So this is a excellent question, and it's a big question too. It's a question we could take, several episodes of this podcast to unpack. Like, what is liberal internationalism? How does that fit with existing, the overall trend? So I think one way to be able to get at this and relates directly to your question is thinking about the approach that Biden took towards and kind of Biden's worldview and comparing it to Trump. And one thing I would say is that Biden was much more of what you would call a realist than I think maybe some people led on, largely because he was contrasting himself at times to Trump. But by realist meaning he was like making decisions that were very interest-based as opposed to value-based, even if they were wrapped up in value language. And so I think that, it's important. I even said that he was a realpolitik. He had a realpolitik foreign policy with an internationalist flair, something like that. Whereas Trump is just flat on like, whatever, we're just going to do what we need to do, and we're not going to worry about the broader consequences of it. We're just focused narrowly on U.S. interests. And so I think that it's important to emphasize that there's not, in a lot of areas, there's not a lot of gap between the two. The approach towards China being most evident, that the Trump administration had started its trade war with China. The Biden administration actually escalated that, and it kind of continued from there. That's one prominent example of where there's actually a lot more continuity between their foreign policies than change. Having said that, I think you can definitely see a contrast in the two of them in a key way, which is the value that they place on the U.S. having a prominent role in the world that is to the benefit maybe more of other countries than to the U.S. itself. So both of them, and that's even something Biden will say, look, I follow America First foreign policy too, but his interpretation of America First is that sometimes it's in America's interest to actually do things that don't necessarily look straight up like the U.S. is gaining and this country's losing. Sometimes it's good. It's in America's interest to do things that maybe look like the U.S. is just giving stuff away, because in the long term, it'll actually benefit the United States by solidifying alliances, avoiding long-term consequences. In contrast, the Trump administration has a much different view of it. They have more of a short-term view of things, of saying, look, there are stuff that in the ideal, we would try to fix and try to solve, but it doesn't point to an immediate U.S. interest, and so we're not going to try to fix it. I think this was very well said by Marco Rubio during his both his confirmation hearings to become Secretary of State, and then also during some subsequent interviews. In particular, he did an interview shortly after becoming Secretary of State. He did an interview with Megyn Kelly, the journalist, and I remember I've used this quote very well because I thought it was a useful quote by him, where he said, "There are a lot of horrible things happening in the world. There really are." He said, he goes on to say, but then there are horrible things that happen in the world that are in U.S. interest to address. And we need to focus on those. So rather than it being a thing of the U.S. has to go around and try to address all these problems because that could in the long term put the U.S. in a better position, build up soft power, all those kind of ways of thinking about it. His was much more of like, can you directly point at this and say there's a U.S. gain from it? Those are the things we have to focus on. Now, part of that, and this is where I think it's a bit, I don't know, ironic is the right word, coincidental, but I think Biden was aware of that. But I think Biden still wanted the U.S. to be in this position of we can do things for the world, even if it isn't directly in U.S. benefit. But he was becoming aware of the fact that the U.S. maybe didn't have the capacity to be doing that as much as it did in the past. Whereas I think the Trump administration has gone all in on the idea that we don't have the capacity to do this, so wherefore we're not even going to try to do these things anymore. And the most evident example of this different worldview is USAID, U.S. foreign aid. Whereas foreign aid is something that is very much in this camp of you do this for the betterment of other people, and it may have a benefit to the U.S. at some point, but it's mostly about that you just think this is the right thing to do. You think it's important, but you can't directly say this solves this particular problem that the U.S. faces. Instead, it's solving a problem that somebody else faces. Well, the Trump administration has obviously gone about just eliminating USAID, cutting foreign aid, largely because not that they're sitting there going, oh, it's bad, we don't realize there's bad things happening, but going back to what Rubio said, which is not every bad thing that's happening in the world can you directly point to it being part of the U.S. national interest, so therefore we're not going to try to solve it.
Well, Professor Poast, again, your time is very precious. I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. To borrow a saying from the former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, he once said, and I quote, "America always knows how to make the best decision after exhausting all the possibilities," end quote. Well, when we look at the complication of the foreign affairs today, and also, as I mentioned in the intro, looking into 2026, everyone, especially, this is something also echo what you wrote in the article, America's allies still remain committed to Washington for now, but they're rather anxious enough to start looking elsewhere for support, especially when Donald Trump mentions about the spending for the military regarding the war in Ukraine. So in other words, he put it very bluntly, it's not U.S. job to keep on putting the chips in the basket. It's time for U.S. to take a step back, because ultimately Donald Trump said it's make America great again, not make the world great again. So how do you think that the allies can still remain committed, but meanwhile, I understand, how should I say, most of them hate to walk away from this relationship. But meanwhile, Donald Trump's this Make America Great Again, looking into midterm election, looking into 2028 or 2034, how do you think this temptation of not looking somewhere else, but still looking at Washington, is still crucial for the allies? Your final thoughts.
So I love the Winston Churchill quote. I'm not sure that Winston, and I use it all the time. I usually phrase it as, America always does the right thing after exhausting all other options.
There you go.
What's interesting though is historians aren't sure that he exactly said it. I've looked into that, but they're like, but he definitely held that kind of view.
That's right.
So whether he actually said he held that view, but it's a great quote because I think it's useful for a couple of reasons. Number one, as I was just saying, whether he directly said that quote, he definitely had that view, and that's important because that was during World War II, right? And during World War II, it was, boy, and recently I've been doing some of my own research on this about like it's like getting FDR on board, and are they actually going to step in? What kind of assistance? And FDR was like, well, I can't really do this, and it's like, boy, I don't know. Can we really count on US? But at the end of the day, he knew it's like that's really our only option. That truly is our only option in the United States. And he never viewed the US as a threat. He just viewed it as the US actually, are they going to believe that these two big, beautiful oceans, which by the way, that's a Trump favorite phrase, are going to continue to protect the United States? And Churchill was like, it's not. And so a big part of Churchill's plea to FDR was trying to convince him, like, look, you can't just sit there and say our two big, beautiful oceans are going to protect you. That's not going to happen, especially if we fail and Hitler gains control of Germany and so forth, or excuse me, gains control of Europe and so forth. So that is an important piece of context, that this view of U.S. allies, even probably our strongest ally, the ally with whom we have the special relationship, are like, at the time when it's like most evident that the U.S. should step in and help, it was like not clear they actually were. And it took them a while to actually do it. And there was a lot of views to say we shouldn't try doing this. That's important because it helps to show that the attitudes that U.S. allies have today are not unprecedented. It's the same idea that today, going forward into 2026, there's a lot of concern that if something happens, will the U.S. actually be there? And at the end of the day, U.S. allies recognize that the U.S. is still the best option to have a balancing ally. There's not really anybody else. But the problem is, the very things that make the U.S. not threatening, the fact that it's an ocean away, is also the same thing that makes the U.S. likely to sit there and say, we don't need to actually get involved. And you actually heard this rhetoric. You heard it whether it was back in FDR's day, you hear it now with Trump explicitly so, saying we got these oceans, this isn't really our problem. But what it means is this has always been a concern for U.S. allies, whether they are allies in Asia, whether they are allies in Europe. And what we've witnessed over the past, say, 80 years since World War II is a shift away from that understanding that Churchill had, and a shift towards a view that, oh yeah, of course the U.S. is here, and the U.S. is going to have its troops, and the U.S. is going to come to our support. Interestingly enough, it's not always been clear the U.S. has actually done that, and it hasn't been fully tested in many ways. But it's always been that belief there that Article 5 will be upheld. And the reality is the Trump administration and officials in the Trump administration itself have still said Article 5 is something we stand by for, and of course, referring to the Mutual Defense Clause of NATO. So there's still, it's not like the Trump administration is just totally backed off allies. But there's, again, this uncertainty. And the way that the allies are approaching things are now much more analogous to how Churchill would have viewed FDR, as opposed to how things have been for the past 80 years, where it was almost taken as, well, of course the U.S. is going to have our back. Now it's more of, well, yeah, the U.S. is going to have our back, but they're probably going to try to do everything else first, and then eventually realize they got to come in and have our back. I think that is the recognition now. And the reason why they have to hedge is because hoping that the U.S. eventually comes to the realization that they have to help is not an effective strategy.
That's right. Well, again, Professor Poast, I couldn't agree with you more. As you mentioned before, hope is not the best strategy. But again, looking to 2026, we do hope that the Trump administration will continue to make better and wiser decisions in terms of building the relationship or strengthening the relationship with the allies. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, such an honor to speak to Professor Paul Poast. Professor Poast is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago, and he's a Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. We strongly encourage everyone to go online to check out this amazing article, again, which is entitled, How Much Abuse Can America's Allies Take? Well, Professor Poast, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. We'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to monitor and follow closely the international affairs. So thank you so much for doing this.